Good evening, I'm Ritika Acharya, and you're watching Bharat Voice. Today we have with us a special guest. Today we have with us Mr. S. Vijay Kumar, who's the co-founder of India Pride Project. India Pride Project helps us get all the stolen and all the smuggled murtis and artifacts which were taken outside India, bring them back to India, and bring our rich heritage back. So welcome, Mr. Vijay Kumar, and let's talk to you and let's understand what exactly does India Pride Project do, and how did you come up with this amazing idea?
Thank you for having me, and it's wonderful to see Bharat's voice being heard. And thanks again for the support. We literally trying to bring gods back home. Uh,
Yeah.
for for too many years, too many centuries, and too many decades, our murtis have been made into showpiece curios. A dollar-driven greed has robbed our temples, and for too long we didn't care. When I say we, I would say that the common man, the people, the government, the custodians, collectively as a group, our gods are being robbed. And this is not some random theft that is happening. Somebody trying to
Right.
steal something. Our research
Hmm.
shows that this is a targeted looting on an industrial scale where
Hmm.
there is a cabal of international art dealers, auction networks, auction houses that are picking and choosing the best of Indian art and literally
Hmm.
looting them. It's a loot to order business that is happening, and this has been happening for too long, and we're
Hmm.
losing our conservative estimates. We are losing close to say 1,000 objects a year. I would say when I say
Oh,
objects,
really?
artifacts. So over a decade, you're talking about 10,000, and these are not just objects. These are picked and chosen. The best of Indian art is being slowly eroded away.
Hmm. 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 But Mr. Vijay Kumar, when you and I were talking offline, you were telling me that you have managed to bring back a lot of artifacts, whereas Indian government, as compared to the Italian government, has brought back only 19 of such artifacts. Please, a little more on that.
Okay, so we need to look at the return of artifacts in the international context, and I would
Hmm.
say that internationally, countries that are rich in culture and rich in
Hmm.
artifacts are termed, though I find it very, very wrong to use that term, we are called
Hmm.
source nations. So you could say Egypt, India, Cambodia,
Hmm.
Italy would be called source nations, no? As though we are
Why?
some mine source nations. So
Why?
as though we are some mine that can be mined for artifacts. So they call us
Hmm.
source nations.
Hmm.
So,
Hmm.
in the early 60s, because of the rampant cultural property trafficking, India and Italy actually pushed the UN to come up with some sort of regulation on a global scale that would apply
Hmm.
across the world because this was such a big problem even then, and we're talking in the 1960s. And finally, the
Right.
UN came up with this statute in 1970, which basically meant that any signatory to the convention, the UN statute, basically you don't have to go to court. So, for example, if an Indian artifact is stolen after 1970, and if it is found in a country that is signatory to the UN convention, India does not have to go to any legal forum for redressal. They can write directly to that country and say that, look, this was plundered, taken out after 1970. Here's the proof. Return my object. And
So
the destination
as long
of
as you have
this,
a proof, you're saying as long as you
the
have a proof
government.
to show that it was
Yes.
stolen, you don't have to go
So
to court.
you don't have to go to courts. Yeah. But then the proof again is something that we finding it increasingly difficult to find
Mhm.
because our temples and our heritage sites are poorly documented. And not only that,
Right.
even if you have documentation, it is not properly archived. But then this 1970 rule doesn't mean that anything prior to 1970 is somehow untouchable. It just means that India has to go to court and it has to file the legal process to get back. A stolen object
Mhm.
continues to be a stolen object. So most European museums and collectors feel that if they can find proof that it left India before 1970, they feel safe, which is untrue, which we have proved in many cases. Now, back to your question.
Hmm.
So, when we split it, that is a CAG report, and this is not numbers that I'm tom-tomming. This is from the CAG
Yes.
report of 2013 on
Yes.
ASI, which is a public document, of course, not as well read as the other CAG report. This CAG
Hmm.
report basically says that India, between 1972 and 2000, brought back
12.
19 artifacts. 2000 to 2012, they brought back zero. So why I'm splitting this into three distinct periods is again because during the same period, for example, to start with, Italy, which actually co-campaigned for this statuette, came up with a national art squad called the Carbonary Art Squad, and they've brought back over a lakh and 78,000 artifacts back. And it's more
Right.
interesting that Italian artifacts are more from tombs. So you have the tomb raiders. So these are basically Etruscan artifacts. These are objects that were buried inside tombs, and a lot of paintings in churches as well. Whereas compared to India, most of the robberies seem to happen from under worship sites. So, on one side, you have a tremendous success story as Italy. On the other side, when I say 19, it's really, really shocking because we have
Right.
documented instances of objects leaving by the hundreds, or if not thousands, documented. A case
So
in
then, how many
point
have
is
India tried? How many have you guys been able to bring back till now?
so between 2013 and now, 58 have physically come back. Another 200 have been promised from America, which will go up, we hear. Plus, a lot more
Hmm.
are in the pipeline. So we are looking at going into three digits pretty soon before the year end. And
Hmm.
we firmly believe that there can be more that can be done if there is proactive
Absolutely.
support because the world's opinion is changing. No, as I said,
Hmm.
no longer is Italy, for example, doesn't ask for proof. They say
Hmm.
this is an Italian artifact. I don't need to show you proof that it was illegally excavated or
Right.
exported. You are the buyer. You show me that you have legally removed from us. Unfortunately,
Hmm.
India, this has not come up. For example, if you take a Gupta artifact or a Chola period artifact, it can only be made in a certain state in India. So the
Hmm.
onus
Hmm.
of proof must move on to the present holder or the buyer, not on a state, considering the vast nature of India's assets.
Right.
Coming back to the success or lack of success, it still hurts us that between 2000 and 2012, India did not bring even one because that was the time when India had caught
Right.
the largest idol smuggler, Vaman Gia. And
Hmm.
despite him confessing to having sold, or rather supposedly confessed to having sold over 10,000 to
Hmm.
20,000 artifacts via Sotheby's, featured in BBC in 1998, part of a book by Peter Watson called Sotheby's Inside Story with a full chapter on India, where on camera these people have said, "Do you want the Taj Mahal? We'll ship it out in parts to you."
Hmm.
Despite
Hmm.
all that, Ghia was arrested in 2003. His farmhouse raids in Delhi yielded more than 800 idols buried, of which 436 are supposed to be certified as antiquities. He walked a free man in 2013, acquitted by the
Hmm.
Rajasthan High Court for want of evidence, and the evidence being none of the so-called 10,000 ever was restituted back to India.
Hmm. Hmm. Hmm.
Now,
But
day before
but
yesterday, we bought back. Yeah.
basically, these whatever you've said so far raises very interesting questions because you're saying that from 2000 to 2012 we got back nothing. I was also
Yes.
reading reports that do you think that there is a certain family, a prominent family in India? Is it is said that they were believed to have take these artifacts out of India and sell them in millions. So and that was quite rampant. And do you think that there's any incident that has happened recently in the last, let's say, 5 6 years of any stealing of artifacts that has happened? Anything that you've
Well,
come
I
across?
would say that our job as facilitators in this basically is to help law enforcement and government in first of all building capacity to stop current thefts, working
Hmm.
to solve objects that are currently coming up for auctions, and also look
Mhm.
at reopening old cases wherein cases have been closed, saying
Right.
non-traceable. And from my
Right.
exposure, I would say that considering the scale and size and the lack of initiative despite open and shut cases, I would say that yes, there is a lot of complicity involved,
Hmm.
not only in the political circle, but also in our enforcement side. And that
Right.
requires a lot of cleaning to be done
Right.
in our customs, in our border checkpoints, in our enforcement. You're talking about money laundering, you're talking about hawala. Unfortunately,
Yes.
we
Yes.
feel that India, I would say that we have failed to realize that what kind of a problem this is. Europe and America have now realized that illicit trafficking of antiquities is actually supporting a lot of nefarious activities, including terrorism financing,
Right.
money
Right.
laundering. Europe is waking up. In fact, there was a report by World Customs day before yesterday where they released the 2019 customs data where in Peru, Mexico are reporting seizures, whereas India has reported zero seizures in its borders for the last 2 years, which is quite surprising. And there have been cases in the past where India has been pretty lax in. So most likely, even this 19 that came back, they are treated as though they're a photo ops. There is no prosecution, and
Right.
cases are closed as though it is a voluntary return where the base facts don't say so. For
So
example, there
have there
was
been
this.
recent cases? Vijay, have there been any recent cases in the last 6 years, let's say?
So yes, since 2011, in fact, I would say the villain of my book. Of course, not trying to pitch my book here, but
Yeah,
then
I'm going to come
Idol
to
Thief.
this. Yes.
So he was arrested in 2011 through a red corner notice in Germany, and he was extradited to India in 2012. And we are still cracking the case. So his
Hmm.
accomplices have, including some who have complicity in the law enforcement in Tamil Nadu, have been charged officially. So there have been three major networks that have been dismantled. There was one led by
Hmm.
Sanjeev Ashokan, one led by Deenadayalan, and another guy from Bombay, Vallabhan Aditya Prakash. So these
Hmm.
were predominant suppliers of Kapoor based out of India. So
Hmm.
yes, it's been happening, but then more could have been done with the wealth of data that India and the U.S. Homeland Security had. So this Homeland Security operation was called Operation Hidden Idol, and you'd be surprised that in 2012 they raided
Hmm.
12 storage locations of Subhash Kapoor in New York alone,
Hmm.
and they
Hmm.
yielded 2,622 objects valued at $108 million. And this was his
Hmm.
holding stock just in New York, a mid-sized dealer. You can
Hmm.
imagine
Hmm.
about 900 crores of stock he maintained just in known places. Wherever else he had hidden, we don't know. And he was in business for
Hmm.
35 years. But then,
Hmm.
unfortunately, the Indian establishment seemed to be in denial of the fact of the scale of this loot, and we are still peddling around single-digit numbers of thefts from archaeological sites. So I think we
Right.
need to wake up. Unless you know you have a problem and say you have a problem, you can't find solutions.
Absolutely. And since you're talking about, we need to wake up. Of course, this is a natural question, and I would have, if I wish I knew about this because, like I was mentioning to you offline the other day that, we lived in London and we were roaming around one day in the streets of Portobello Road, and we saw that there are many antique shops there. And you walk into a shop and you see something which looks a artifact or a statue that looks very Indian. And I walked up to a shopkeeper and I asked him as to, where is this from? And he didn't give me an answer. He gave me a very sheepish look. So I wish I knew about you back then. And therefore, what about the youngsters? If somebody wants to join you, if somebody wants to help you, somebody wants to volunteer, and therefore be able to identify from a replica, identify a real artifact, and how do we report it to you? How does it work?
Okay. Okay. First of all, I would say that be safe. You're talking about criminal networks, so don't
Yeah,
put yourself
yeah,
at risk. Be aware that you are entering a potential crime site. I'm
yeah,
talking about the situation that you mentioned, and leave it to the
right,
professionals. But if you are
right.
allowed to photograph as a prospective buyer, you can look us up. And I
Hmm,
said there are two things that I think we need to do to solve this problem of theft, and that is documentation. Once an object is
mhm,
documented, it becomes unsellable in the international market. So my request to all your readers and all people is go to your villages. You have your Kuladeva with us. Each one of us take photos of our temples and insist on the temple custodians to document in case they don't allow you to at least take and
hmm,
keep photographs. Once it
right.
is the biggest problem that we have is we know an object is stolen. It's very simple.
Hmm,
You go to every museum, the hands are cut. That's because they were anchored to the floor and they were broken off, chipped away, and sent out. You know the
hmm,
paperwork is fake. For example, Australia is holding about 22 objects still to return to India because we can't find
hmm,
proof that where it was stolen from. We know it's stolen. The
hmm,
paperwork is all fake, but they're not returning it back, the National Gallery of Australia, because they want proof from us. And it's pretty
Hmm.
sad that we don't have proof of these magnificent creations of our ancestors who left it behind for us. We don't even have a single photo of these huge door guardians. We have these huge metal bronzes that have
Hmm.
survived for thousands of years with loving care of our villages, our communities. Sadly, we as the next generation are not doing our duty. So I would say the first thing that you need to do is document it, and the documentation is so document, document, document. And in
Right.
case you come across anybody who says, an old man says, or something here that was stolen, we have interesting anecdotes that we can share where people have come
Hmm.
back to us thinking that it is an unsolvable theft case. But then,
Hmm.
you never know. The universe conspires when the good people get together, and we've solved cases from
Right.
1961. So the issue is, if the three most important things that are hampering us right now is lack of
Hmm.
documentation, lack of
Hmm.
documentation of thefts. So there are no FIRs, and even if there are FIRs are closed as non-traceable, and the local population, even though they have photographs, they don't report it. So if
Hmm.
anybody can
Hmm.
reach
Hmm.
out to us with clear evidence of thefts, you can look us up. My Twitter ID is Poetry in Stone, and all information is held confidential. As I said, whenever you read about temple theft, it strikes you at the heart. But then this is a long drawn process. You will not see results immediately, but don't lose heart. Once you provide us
Hmm.
information, we keep it live.
Hmm.
And the art
Hmm.
market has this habit of fencing art objects. They have big monies,
Hmm.
they have $1 million budgets, so they put it in free ports in Switzerland, and you will get to see the object after 15 years and 10 years. But then don't lose hope. We are sure that
Hmm.
as and when these objects come up for sale, these theft reports will come in handy for India to get back. Lastly,
Okay.
the main thing is like the work that you're doing. Please share
Hmm.
these instances so that uh,
Yes.
the ministries, the custodians realize that they have a problem. The main issue
Hmm.
now is since we are peddling around 3 and 4 thefts per year, which is definitely not the case. If you even Google for news stories that have come up about robberies in temples, so I think
Hmm.
at a national level, there has to be a call to first realize that yes, India has a problem of losing antiquities, not just from
Hmm.
ASI sites. They could be from the state sites. So there's a lot of work that's happening by the collecting lobby cabal, for example, in India, where they want to dilute the already toothless Antiquity Act. So so
Hmm.
basically they want to commoditize artifacts so that there can be free trade of artifacts within India, without
Oh,
realizing that
really?
without an so
Hmm.
in fact there was an attempt to place this in Parliament. Right now, if you have something that's over 100 years old, the
Hmm.
Antiquity Act of 1972, adopted in 1977, basically says that anything over 100 years of value is supposed to be an artifact. It cannot be exported out of India. And if you have it legally in your home, which has come through
Hmm.
generations, you have to register it.
Hmm.
Once you register it, it becomes non exportable. It's as simple
Hmm.
as that.
Hmm.
And to register it, you have to take it to ASI, who will conduct an inquiry. They'll ask you how you got it. They'll check. They'll say this is antique, and then you get a
Hmm.
certificate. You can sell it after that within India, but it cannot be exported out of India. But people are saying that this is too cumbersome. They should do
Hmm.
away with the gatekeeper. ASI should not
Hmm.
involve in issuing the certificate, and there should
Hmm.
be no certificate need. They'll just have a website where you register it, and that means you're like you're driving on the road. You see a hero stone. You can just put it
Hmm.
in the back of your car and becomes yours.
Hmm. 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 Uh, Vijay, since I'm talking to you, also, I have to mention that, what also strikes me in the heart is we cannot ignore that, when we go abroad and we go to museums and we go to the Indian section and you see the Indian artifacts lying there. And especially when, I used to go to these British museums and stuff. I used to often wonder that vaguely mention that it's donated by someone or they are, let's say, the tag says they are from Amravati. So you have to obviously, end up thinking that. Were these all brought back by East India Company? They are vaguely donated by someone. Where are these coming from?
So,
Can we say that? Is
so first
will it be
is
too much of a statement?
no, even
I was saying,
within
will it be too much of
colonial.
a statement to say that all these? artifacts in the museums are, some of them are definitely stolen.
Stolen, there are different ways in which stolen has to be defined. And we are
Hmm.
talking about a period where the laws were unclear. I'll give you two
Hmm.
examples. So there's this example of a Danish colony in South India called Trankeba, wherein the Danish
Hmm.
collector was excavating for his fort. He comes across a buried hoard of 30 sacred objects, including bronzes. Basically, he gets a right to establish a trading port in a
Hmm.
very small village to be a trading post. There they build a fort, and as they are excavating for the fort, they come across 30 bronzes, 30 sacred objects, including bronzes. The local priests basically cry and ask him to give it because there's a temple right behind the wall that he's building. Idols have lost their power,
Hmm.
and I will take them with me. And he gives them a bag of rice and some betel nuts. They are
Hmm.
now donated by Peter Anker to the Danish Museum with a note that
Hmm.
says Peter Anker bought it from the locals. He doesn't
Hmm.
say
Hmm.
what he bought it with. He gave them a
Hmm.
bag of rice for 30
Hmm.
objects.
Hmm.
Similarly,
Hmm.
there was another gentleman who bought from Karnataka Hoysala sculptures by giving a pair of spectacles.
Oh, really? Huh.
And then in the V&A, for example, there is a Vishnu with consorts where they were also buried hoard found in Coimbatore, and they were auctioned. And the man who won the auction was Lord Curzon, the Viceroy of India. And actually, the
Right.
temple bid against him for up to 1,000 rupees. But then, so now it's bequeathed by Lord Curzon to the V&A. And then
Hmm.
coming back
Hmm.
to Amaravati, which is another story. In fact, I'd written a detailed article in Mayan Makers. I called them
Hmm.
the no, the Elgin marbles are internationally known. So I call them the Elliot limestones because
Hmm.
Elliot actually conspired, overcoming objections from the field archaeologist who said that no, there are so many intact portions of the Amaravati.
So, Vijayji, we were talking about, when you go to the British museums and stuff, you always see these statues which are particularly from Amravati, and many of them are from Amravati. As to how is it that, they all land up there in the British museums? And I was reading a report that, as of 2017, the V&A Museum alone has around 25,000 Indian artifacts. So, where are all these coming from?
Okay, so most of the V&A's collections come from the British India, British Museum. So I would say that let's finish Amaravati first, which is an interesting story. In fact, I had
Hmm.
written about it in my end about calling them the Elliot limestones, comparing them to the Elgin marbles because it was similar injustice was done to these fantastic second century BC, very rare, comparable, beautiful sculptures comparable to Sanchi. In fact,
Hmm.
I've had an expert art teacher take a 1 hour session on just one panel of Taming of Nalagiri Elephant of Buddha's life stories. Such a brilliant collection was dispersed. It was split into three. One part was sent to the Madras Museum, and one was sent to the Indian Museum in Calcutta. And of course, Elliot picked the best to be shipped out to London, where they sat in the open for about 12 years before they finally found a place for it inside the museum. But then, what is interesting is he went over objections from the field archaeologist, his own team, which said that our job is not to steal these objects out of India. Our job as archaeologists is to preserve them in situ and reconstruct them. But then they were taken away, and of course, we have multiple such cases. The British Museum, of course, bulk of it comes from an interesting character called Hindu Stewart. I don't know if you've heard of him. He was a British officer who was in Calcutta, and he
Hmm.
was basically he was almost a devout Hindu. So that was what he was called a Hindu Stewart. And he collected a
Hmm.
lot of artifacts to show
Hmm.
visiting British dignitaries that no, this is not a civilization of barbarians. But unfortunately, when he died, he built his collection. Basically, he wanted to build a museum in India for
Hmm.
Britishers to see it. But unfortunately, when he died, he left his collection to his family, and this family did not want to be in India, and then they were shipped out to London, and then they
Hmm.
eventually found their way back into the British Museum. Lastly,
Wow.
bulk of the collection comes from a Chinese dealer called C.T. Lu, who was
Oh, really?
in Paris. Yeah. So Lu basically was a smuggler of Chinese antiquities, and not much is known about his India aspects. So Lu
Uh-huh.
supplied over 300 to 500 major works of art, and he obtained it through his scholarly contact, who masqueraded as a scholar in Pondicherry in between 1926 and 1940. So Dubriol, who is considered by many to be an expert in Pallava art, was actually funded by C.T. Lu and was his agent, procuring artifacts and shipping it to Paris to C.T. Lu, who in turn sold it to the Musée Guimet, to Rijksmuseum, to the British Museum, to all the world's museums. So it's a story that has to be told. The C.T. Lu Dubriol combine actually took out bulk of a Yogini temple as well, which is part of Padma Kamal's book called Dispersed Yoginis. 28 idols were found. He gave a broken door guardian to the Metas Museum, and 27 of them were shipped to City Lu to be sold to almost all the world's museums.
All right, that's very interesting. But this makes me think that you're dealing with so many of these. You're dealing with the ASI, you're dealing with the customs, you're dealing with all the legal authorities, you're dealing with the governments, you're dealing with governments of different countries. This must be a very, very complicated process. And you're in a field where you're probably dealing with some bad guys as well. How do you handle it?
Well, we are doing God's work, and to me, I've seen cases where great souls in the 10th century. I quote this example in my book as well. Four gentlemen, Shiva devotees, basically custodians of Shiva's wealth, gave up their lives in terms of a property dispute. They actually jumped into the fire to say that this is property of Shiva, our word is to stand. The king then punished the local bigwig who tried to usurp the temple land and made
Mhm.
bronzes of these four people and kept it in the temple. And so that was a punishment given to the guy who tried to usurp the land. So we're talking about our ancients considering the property of Shiva to be so sacrosanct, and here we are talking about Shiva himself being stolen and sold for 5.6 and $8 million. So I believe that if we don't talk, who else will talk? And I think that our voices should come up, because too long has India. So that's why we called it the India Pride Project. You should be ashamed. I gave you this example. If somebody picks your pocket on the street, you gang up with five guys to beat them up and recover your
Yeah.
property. And here, people are openly vandalizing, stealing your gods, reducing them to showpiece curios, to align swimming pools in the West, bedrooms in the West. These gods, where they were, living gods. For me personally, the bronzes that I've special interest in, Chola bronzes, they're called Tirumenis in Tamil, which literally translates to being bodies of God. So they would be woken up, they would be washed, they would be bathed, they would be dried, they would be fed, they would be clothed, they would be weddings would happen to them, and in the night they would be sung to and they would be put to sleep. So the priests and the kings would, the original donors would treat them as living gods, and to then see them to be reduced to such a pathetic state, it really hurts. And that they were safe for thousands of years. And in fact, I opened my book with that sordid tale, in the sense that because they were so precious, when there was a invasion by iconoclasts into South India in 1314, 1313, most of the idols, it's wrong to call them idols, the bronze murtis were buried for safekeeping. And for some reason, even after the threat went off after 6 months, most likely the custodians gave up their lives, not giving the secret of where their gods were buried. So even today in Tamil Nadu and in southern India, you find buried hoards coming up, and we are talking 700 years hence that we are seeing lots of temple bronzes coming out of the ground. So that was the sacrifice of our ancients who gave up their lives, because otherwise, I see no reason why, after the threat was passed, they could have very well come. They went to so much of lengths to protect them, burying them safely. So
So
to
it's
me,
definitely So it's definitely, you're saying, worth going all the complexities and worth going all the levels of communication with the governments and uh, customs and ASI and all of that, because we're getting our heritage back.
well, for us, each one of them that comes back drives a nail into the collecting lobby cabal. Australia has lost about $25 million to India so far, and they've established a rule that they've told all their public funded museums not to buy any Indian art. So for us,
Hmm.
that's a brilliant victory because that's where, akin to ivory, when the buying stops, the killing stops, and that's what we are
Right.
targeting at. So earlier, if there was a Khmer artifact or a Cambodian artifact or an Italian artifact and an Indian artifact, the guy
Hmm.
would say, "Take the Indian artifact. Nobody will come after you." Italians are a little more diligent. So we just
Hmm.
want to
Hmm.
mention that there is a team of dedicated people who are watching you guys, who are trying to sell our art. If you put our gods for sale, better watch out. We are there behind your back. We'll make sure that you don't have
Absolutely.
your free reign, and we will restore India's pride one murti at a time, if need be.
Absolutely. And here is a good time to talk about your book because your book published in 2018 and your book is called The Idol Thief and you talk about this notorious smuggler from the US and then he was caught. If you can please tell us about him. Subhash Kapoor I'm talking about.
Well, interesting legend. I would call him a legend because he should never have happened. Because his father was actually implicated in a theft of a Vishnu idol in 1970. So, if our wheels of justice were so slow that allowed him to escape to the US, if
Hmm.
our justice system had been prompt, no, that this family tradition of robbing our temples would have stopped right then.
Hmm.
So
Hmm.
this seems to be a family tradition because his sister is also being charged now of hiding four
Hmm.
bronzes in New York. And so basically, we have this Indian origin. Later he converted to a US citizen, and he basically wined and dined with women. He had girlfriends all over. So it's quite an interesting character. But then what is surprising is most high-profile museums fell for his guises. So there's this museum in Ohio called Toledo Museum where he sold a Ganesha for about $750,000. But then he gave
Hmm.
them a gift, including cash donations and 240 terracotta Gupta era miniatures valued at $1 million. Now, in the
Hmm.
same year, so here's a dealer who is selling you something for 750,000, and then he gives you something for $1 million. To
Hmm.
me, it doesn't make sense. If you want to
Hmm.
sweeten the
Hmm.
deal, you maybe give something. You go, you get coriander free. You don't
Yeah.
pay for coriander and get the main things. So we call it optical due diligence because most of the paperwork that was peddled by him, including certificates of provenance, wouldn't stand diligence. So me and my friend, Mr. Jason Fels, and some of our volunteers, we call it optical due diligence. So basically, they just do just about enough. So imagine you spend $1 million on an artifact based on just a piece of paper. So I
Hmm.
think they thought India would never care. So they just now, I hope after all these heavy losses, people will be more diligent in their purchases. And only when,
But now
as we
he's
said,
but
yeah,
now he's caught and the trial is still on, I believe.
yeah, he's still in under trial. The case has gone through a lot of, different. Unfortunately, I would say that on the US side, there have been a lot more exposures happening. In fact, he was charged. The US has filed for his extradition along with his accomplices in 2019.
Mhm.
They've
Mhm.
asked for the extradition of Kapoor, Sanjeevi Ashokan, his main supplier, Deen Dayal, and also Aditya Vallabh Prakash, and a host of other people. So there is a lot more into this case because we found paperwork leading to another gallery called Vienna Galleries, who was up and running till 1970s. We've
Right.
got cases where she was dealing with Vamangia, which I talked to you about. And then we
Hmm.
also had a lot of seizures in 2016. Homeland Security raided Asia Week, New York, where over
Hmm.
6 raids they see $20 million worth of stuff. So there's a lot more action that needs to be done. Unfortunately, India is not alone on this. Globally, no art dealer seems to be ever serving time behind bars. It's only the petty
Hmm.
thieves that are. So, in
Hmm.
fact, the US, the last successful prosecution was in 2002, I think, of an
Hmm.
Egyptian trafficker. So,
Hmm.
the art market is a gray market. It's not
Hmm.
black or white, it's gray. And a
Yes.
lot of international law enforcement do not know about this art market. So, I feel
Hmm.
globally there needs to be more control and
Hmm.
more legislation that comes in to police the art market. Until that is done, in
Hmm.
fact, there is a case where a Nataraja was stolen from Tamil Nadu in 2005. They actually
Hmm.
used a saw to cut off his left hand to melt it to
Oh.
see if it had gold. And when the jeweler who was given the job of finding melting it said there is no gold, there was an argument, and he was killed. So it was a
Oh.
murder case, and similarly, we have a lot of temple custodians, temple guards who've been killed. So we are not talking
Hmm.
about just white collar crime here. We are talking about
Right.
physical
Right.
risk on the ground. And
Hmm.
of course, what we have to see is the other aspect is because of the risk to these icons, most of them are now being moved to safe icon centers in Tamil Nadu, for example. They're building up these safe storages. This
Hmm.
disrupts the daily functioning of the temple. So earlier,
Hmm.
as I said, these bronzes were part of a daily worship ritual. Now these bronzes are kept in a safe deposit locker and released only for major festivals. So that happens once in a
Hmm.
month or once in 2 months. So the daily functioning of the temples, and nobody wants to go to the temples anymore. So I
Hmm.
feel that
Hmm.
there has to be a relook at stricter, harsher penalties, because right now the harshest that they can give is under the Customs Act, which is 6 years,
Hmm.
under IPC, which is again 6 years. And in fact, there is a strange amendment to this IPC section in Tamil Nadu, which says you steal from. So this is actually housebreaking theft, in which they put temple thefts as. So
Hmm.
in Tamil
Hmm.
Nadu, if you go into a house and steal, it's 6 years. If you go into a temple and steal, it's 3 years.
Hmm. Hmm. Hmm.
So
That's
no,
that's just
ridiculous.
crazy. That's just
Yeah,
absolutely crazy.
and this is a special state amendment passed in 1992. And on
Hmm.
record, the Hindu Religious Endowments Board in Tamil Nadu has filed a counter last year in a High Court, where they
Hmm.
claim that between 92 and 2012, they have lost close to 1,238 stone and bronze murtis
Hmm.
just under temples. This is just reported thefts. So you can
Okay.
imagine the size and scale of this loot.
So, Vijay, can we put a number? Is it possible to put a number on this? I know you're going to say priceless, but can we at least estimate as to how many artifacts we got back, and therefore how much worth were they worth? Were they worth like billions of dollars, or what is it?
So for to me, as I said, I would never want to price our gods. They are
Hmm.
priceless. We can only take guesstimates because again the art market is opaque. There are no studies. There are only surveys that can be done. But
Hmm.
just look at it. The court filing in US by Homeland Security lists the value of assets seized from Kapoor, which I told you about.
Hmm. Hmm.
2,622 objects were valued at $108 million.
Hmm.
That's
Hmm.
800 crores. That's
Hmm.
just one his holding stock. So
Hmm.
to me,
Hmm.
it's just 10% of reported thefts. So then you can expand to see the size and scale of this loot, and more importantly, where is this money going? And definitely, this money that is coming in through Hawala is not going to go for development activities. I think
Hmm. Hmm.
Indian law enforcement should work with global law enforcement to not only probe porous borders, but also look at the banking system and the Hawala system that is actually funding this. Because obviously they are not going to invoice for the full value. So basically they invoice, they show it. So in fact, Kapoor was sending out these as garden furniture and
Hmm.
hand brass objects. So he's not
Hmm.
going to invoice it for the full value.
Hmm.
So it's quite interesting and quite strange. And more can be done if there is more support on the ground and from law enforcement.
Okay, great. Lastly, this brings me to the end of this discussion, but I have to ask you, recently there was an incident and we heard in the news that Natesha was brought back to Rajasthan. So, can you tell us what exactly happens when you bring them back to India? Are they reinstated back in the temples or they go directly to the museums? Because the museums also in India are in a very sad state. So what happens to them?
Okay, our first objective is if it is taken from a known site, it has to go back to the known site. Most of the cases in Tamil Nadu, that is what has been the guarantee by the state as well. Unfortunately, the trials are ongoing, and these
Mhm.
that are brought back are evidence in trials. So we have a few cases where bronzes were returned to the temples for ceremonial purposes, but then taken back as evidence in court. So our main objective is that these are murtis that are fit for worship. They have to go back to the sites, and then there are
Okay.
these objects where we exactly don't know where they are from.
Hmm.
So they are going now to a new museum that's built in Delhi, which is called the
Oh,
Stolen Artworks Returned Museum that they are
okay.
going to.
Okay.
But I think these should go back to the state. And in fact, if we get what we want, that in the next couple of months, we could do one in every state.
Hmm.
I
Hmm.
think
Hmm.
mainly the fear is they would be get stolen again, but which is grossly untrue.
Exactly, exactly.
Again,
I mean, what if it
again,
gets again?
No, again, it's a mentality. These have been well documented. So, as the first thing that I told you, a documented object that has been publicized has no
Mhm,
value in the black market. Once you document it,
mhm,
see if you melt a bronze, the value is it's worthless.
mhm,
Nobody's going to steal it for gone are those days. So they're selling it.
mhm,
They're stealing it because of the sale value. And once a
mhm,
guy knows that it cannot be openly exhibited forever, he has
mhm,
to keep it hidden, its value, and
mhm,
especially in public museums are not going to demonstrate or not display it. So once you
mhm,
document it, and once you have a strong national art squad that is
mhm,
monitoring auction sales, that is monitoring auction catalogs, and goes and
mhm.
stops people selling Indian art openly, I think the demand for Indian art globally will come down.
All right, great. With that, I'll end today's interview. Thanks a lot for joining with us, Mr. Vijay Kumar. And as you rightly said, and I'll put this last message out to everyone who's watching us, that stay alert, be safe, and if you see something, please report it. Please connect with India Pride Project and tell them safely that you've seen something. And we live in a world of technology, we live in a world of social media. Let's all make a noise about it and let's all be very, very aware that these things happen and this is a big problem. Thank you so much, Mr. Vijay Kumar.
Thank you, and hope to get back to you with some good news post COVID as well. More of our gods are coming home.
Absolutely, absolutely. Thank you so much.